Okay, this is going to be the last video in this section. It's going to be the last lecture. It's going to be sort of an introduction to more advanced JavaScript concepts. And it's sort of like an intro to asynchronous programming, which asynchronous just means that a code will not complete in full the first time it's run. It will like start something and then it will have to pause, and then it will pause, let other code run, so it's not stopping the other code because this code's paused. So while it's paused, you want other code to run so you're not wasting time, and then later come back to your paused code and continue it. That's sort of a basic idea of what asynchronous programming is. But this video is going to be more covering callbacks, which don't need to be asynchronous. A callback is basically just a function that you pass into a function that gets called inside that function. That's really confusing. I'll show you what it means. So imagine we had this function called connect. Now connect is going to take a callback, and then here let's just say we're connecting. So let's assume that connecting takes some time. So it doesn't connect instantly. It takes half a second or whatever. It's fast, but it's not instant. So you want to do something after it connects. So right now we're just gonna sort of imagine that this is taking some time, because we're not actually working with asynchronous code yet. I'm just gonna show you what a callback is to simplify it a little bit. Okay, so connect. So when we call connect, we're going to want to pass in a function here. So let's call in console.log, but we're not actually going to call console.log. We're just going to pass it in like this, which is a little weird because throughout this entire section we've seen console.log, but we've never seen it passed in used like this. We've always seen it be called. There's always parentheses at the end of log, which in this case there isn't. So console.log is an argument. It's callback. The connect function takes an argument called callback. And what do you want to do with callback? You want to call it. So this is assuming that you're passing a function into it. You kind of have to pass in a function to it, or else there's going to be an error. It's going to say, right here, you're trying to call it. So if you just pass in a string, for example, this isn't going to work. See, it's a type error. It says callback is not a function because it's a string. But if you put console log, let's call a callback with a string. Let's say finished connecting. So now it works. It says connecting, the dot dot dot, and then it finished connecting, which is passed into the callback, which you passed in when you called it, which is a bit confusing, but that's how it is. And another thing that you could do is you could do what's known as an anonymous function, which is when you declare the function inside calling it. So console.log already exists. You don't have to write it. It's built into JavaScript. What if you didn't want to run console log? What if you wanted to make your own function? So this is a function. This is totally valid code right here. Just pass in a function to it. And what is this function going to do? Well, this function is going to get called right here, because this function is an argument. It's callback. Callback's getting called with this value. Okay, so you could say console.log, and let's just do dot 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 dot, and this function expects a value because it's this. This is this value right here. And if this is a bit confusing, That's normal. This is kind of confusing code. That's what I said at the beginning. It's sort of getting into a bit more advanced stuff. So here it is. Let me get rid of this. It's not needed. So here it says connecting ... and then finish connecting. And here you'd be able to do anything you want. You'd be able to run another function, change values around, do whatever you want. But okay, so let's get rid of this now. Okay, so that example that I just gave you wasn't really asynchronous. The code was all executing immediately. It was just using a callback. Usually callbacks are used passed in, and that code that you pass in as a callback won't run instantly. It will take some time to run. Usually because the function you're passing it into doesn't complete instantly. And we're going to see two instances of that before the end of this video. JavaScript has built-in timers where you could run a function to do something in a set amount of time. So, but an analogy I want to give you for what asynchronous code is like imagine you're reading a book and you want to eat. You're hungry. So you put some food in the oven and you set a timer for 15 minutes, let's say. So instead of just sitting and doing nothing for 15 minutes, you can continue reading because you don't want to waste your time. Your time is valuable, so you're reading, you get a signal that says you're hungry, so you're like, okay, I have to prepare something, I have to go do something, and you go do that, but then you have to put a timer on, and then you go back to reading, and the timer's on, and then when the timer finishes, you get a signal that the timer finishes, so then you stop reading again, then you go eat, because now your food's ready. So that's what it's like. It's like you're not wasting your time while waiting for something. So that's like what asynchronous code is. When something, like if something takes a second to connect to a database, you don't want your code to just be stopped for a whole second while you're doing the connecting. The connecting you could send a signal out to your database server, wherever it is, somewhere on the other side of the planet. It's going to connect, and then it's going to send it back to you, the connection. That's fine. While it's there, while it's doing its thing, your code in your program could continue, and when the signal comes back, you could run code which would be set in the callback. If this is still really confusing, don't worry about it. It's still new. I'm going to show you a better example here. So I got a cook food function. Cook food. Console.log. Just started cooking food. And there's a function in JavaScript called setTimeout, which takes in two arguments. It takes in a callback and a time to wait before calling that callback. So the first thing is the callback. So this is a function, and it's going to execute time to eat. But it's not going to execute instantly. It's going to wait 2 seconds. And these are milliseconds, 2000 milliseconds. So that's 2 seconds. And let's just call this. So there, see, it console logged, just started cooking food instantly. Once this called, this ran right away. And then it set the timeout, and it only ran this code, which is inside a function, which is right here, which if you look, it's the first parameter set into setTimeout. And then the arguments are separated by comma, so then there's a comma, and then the amount of time to wait. So it's probably hard to picture. Usually we're used to seeing functions be called on one line, and when you pass in a function like this, it sort of breaks that up a little bit and it makes it harder to read. But it's the same thing as putting your first value here and your second value here. It's just instead of a 12, you're putting in an entire function. So like this. So you can see here that this function is it's just the first argument. This shouldn't take any arguments though. Okay, and yeah. Okay, let's make a function to eat. And in here, let's do another set timeout. And inside, console.log done eating. But you're not going to be done eating right away. You're going to take some time. 3 seconds. Okay, and let's have another function called read. And so when we do set timeouts, we could store the what's known as a timer ID inside a variable like this. We could say let timer ID, and this variable could be called anything. I'm just naming it what it is. It's a timer ID. And set interval. So set interval is like set timeout, except instead of running code in that amount of time, so this code, when this function gets called eat, it's going to run this code in 3 seconds. Just once though. What set interval does is it will run that code over and over again every X amount of seconds. So it's like set timeout, but a loop. It just keeps going forever. So what do you want to loop? You want to loop console.log reading every half a second. And also you want to return timer ID. Okay, and when you eat, you want to clear timeout. What clear timeout does is it stops the interval. So this interval will just keep doing the same thing over and over again forever, but not if you clear timeout. So clear timeout takes an ID, and it is the reading ID. And also inside here, read. And then, so you might be wondering, what is a reading ID? That doesn't exist yet. Well, it doesn't exist yet. We're going to make it now. So let reading ID is equal to read. Okay, so all these functions are declared, but I'm never actually executing any of them. So here I finally am, and I'm executing read, which read will do something every 500 milliseconds. It's just going to say reading, 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 reading. It's going to say that forever. And it's also going to return timer ID. And then also, I want to run cook food right afterwards. So cook food is going to log just started cooking food. And then in 2 seconds, it's going to call eat and then say time to eat. And then when it eats, you will clear timeout reading ID, so it will stop saying reading every half a second, and at this point do nothing for 3 seconds, and then when it's done, it will say done eating, and it will call read again, where it will continue calling reading. Okay, so this is all really confusing, and I hope some of it makes sense to you, and if it doesn't, you could just rewatch the video or work with the code a bit, change things around, get messy with it. I just want to show you how this works. So it says reading, reading, time to eat, then it stops, done eating, and it goes back to reading. And then it will do this forever. You could, as a challenge, try to make it only read for 10 seconds and then stop for good, do something else, maybe go to sleep, whatever it is. Let's just see this one more time. So you start cooking food, then you're reading, then you stop for 3 seconds, and then you go on. Okay, so that was a tough video. It's really, really confusing when you first get introduced to this sort of asynchronous programming. There was a lot to cover in this video. The callbacks, the set timeouts, the set intervals, the timer IDs, the clear timeout. I get it, it's confusing. But just go over the code, try making a mini version of this, or just try working with set timeouts or set intervals. Like you could just for practice, just to get used to it, you could just do like a much simpler example where you this is almost going to be like a loop. Do this every 100 milliseconds. The only difference between this and a loop is that loops execute instantly. They just execute instantly. This one, if you look here, what just happened? Did I call this set timeout? Oh, right. This, I meant to do set interval. Set interval. So it's kind of like a loop, but like if you wait a minute and you come back, the code will still be executing. Whereas a loop would do it in one frame. It would just do it instantly and then it would carry on. This is sort of like just doing it over and over again every 10th of a second. Okay, so that's going to be it for this video, and that wraps up the first section on JavaScript.